last lecture, 2 years put that.
Okay. It's up to you.
Yeah, I guess you can directly start.
Okay. Well, thank you. And so, I don't know if any of you, I gave a lecture at the university yesterday as well, and so I don't know if any of you were there too. There definitely will be a lot of overlap between today and yesterday, but there's also a lot of new material too. So if you were there, I'm definitely going to go into more depth on some of the topics that I sort of glossed over, and so I do think there is, you will learn something new today. But in any case, I'll be talking about computer poker, and this is going to be pretty similar. I gave a tutorial at the AAAI conference a few months ago in San Francisco, and this is going to be fairly similar to the tutorial that I gave there. Introduction, and I know for some of you, you saw the same introduction, same examples yesterday. I apologize for that. But as an introduction here, I'm going to give a little excerpt from the PhD thesis of John Nash from 1950. And so this is the abstract of his thesis. Actually, it was only a 20-page thesis. The main mathematical result is the proof of the existence in any game of at least one equilibrium point. Other results concern the geometrical structure of the set of equilibrium points of a game with a solution, the geometry of subsolutions, and the existence of a symmetrical equilibrium point in a symmetrical game. As an illustration of the possibilities for application, a treatment of a simple three-man poker model is included. And so, as he states here, it's clear that one of the motivating applications for his solution concept, which is now called Nash equilibrium, was a poker game. And so, actually, poker was studied by a lot of studied by von Neumann, a lot of other early mathematicians. And so it's clear that poker dated all the way back to the founding of game theory as a motivating application. And you can actually see in his table of contents, section 8, a three-man poker game, this is the only application that's listed here motivating his new concept. And actually he states, and poker is the most obvious target. The analysis of a more realistic poker game than our very simple model should be quite an interesting affair. And so it's just sort of interesting to see all the way back since the founding of the field that poker was already this problem on everyone's mind. Actually, my first conference I attended, it was in 2008, and it was on a project on an algorithm for a three-player poker tournament. And actually, I was presenting this at the poster session. This was at the World Games Congress in Chicago, and John Nash approached me at the conference and at the session. He asked me what I was working on. I said it was a three-player poker game, and he said, "Hey, I worked myself on a three-player poker game a while ago," actually referring to the problem in his PhD thesis. And so it was pretty cool. This was my first ever conference, my first ever project, and I was able to talk to John Nash about it. And so this was, like I mentioned, poker was already a motivating problem back when game theory was founded, and so it's received a lot of interest much more recently, starting in around 2000 in the computer science and AI community in terms of coming up with scalable algorithms for creating agents for poker. And so I'm going to sort of summarize the important milestones over the years. So the first main paper that was on computer poker was back in '98. It's called Opponent Modeling in Poker, and it was by the group at University of Alberta, which has produced very, very strong poker agents over the years by Doris Billings and the rest of the team. And so this looked at a heuristic approach for doing opponent modeling to learn to play against weak opponents, and it really didn't have any theory. It actually didn't have much game theory. It was more of heuristic learning algorithm. Then starting in around 2000, there was this paper by Shi and Littman where it started to look at it from a game theoretic approach, and it looked at the problem trying to approximate equilibrium strategies using abstraction, which is basically the technique for approximating the full game with a smaller game. And then actually a few years later, there's a paper approximating game theoretic optimal strategies for full-scale poker. This was again by the Alberta group, and I believe it won the best paper award at HCI, which is one of the best AI conferences. And so here was where they're trying to approximate Nash equilibrium strategies. This was for limit Texas Hold'em, two-player limit Texas Hold'em. I'll explain the rules and the different variants a little bit later on. And so that was in 03. Then 2005, group at CMU computed the optimal strategies in a simplified variant that they had made up called Rhode Island Poker. But nonetheless, this was much larger than the previous largest imperfect information game that had been solved. And so they needed to develop new techniques. The existing linear program algorithm didn't scale to this game. So that was still a pretty big achievement just due to the size of the game. Starting in 2006, there was what's called the annual computer poker competition, which is held at the main AI conferences at AAAI and at HCI. It's been held every year since then. And basically, teams, mostly universities, some recreational hobbyists, or I guess people in industry, submit agents. Anyone can submit, and they play the computer programs against each other. And usually, so it started off with just two-player limit, and over the years they've included two-player no limit. One year they had six-player limit, and then it was pretty chaotic, and then they went down to three-player limit, and actually this year they didn't include three-player, but they're talking about including multiplayer in the future. And so the variants that they've had have changed over the years. It started with the focus on two-player limit. More recently, two-player no limit has been the main focus, and this has really spurred a lot of good algorithms, and it's given a good test bed for, when we create an agent, how do you know how good it is? Well, at least now you can play it against all these other agents and compete. And so this really has done a lot of research in this area. Then starting around the same time, so in 06 to 08, there were the development of a lot of new abstraction and equilibrium finding algorithms. And so there's one from CMU, this EGT stands for excessive gap technique, it's with these automated abstraction algorithms, and those were used to create CMU's agents, which did well in the competition consistently. In addition, in 07, there was this algorithm developed at the University of Alberta called counterfactual regret minimization, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. And so this actually has become the main algorithm used since then by all the strongest agents for poker and for large imperfect information games. It's been applied also to security and medicine. And so this is developed in 07 and has been the main algorithm pretty much used currently. Then in 2008 to 2009, for two-player limit Texas Hold'em, they had these man versus machine competitions where they played the program. This was the program from Alberta, played against human professionals. And so the first year in 08, the humans won, and then in 09, the computers won, and it was statistically significant. And so, so that happened all the way back in 08 and 09 for limit Texas Hold'em. Then another event was starting in 2012. There was this workshop. I organized it 2 years, I think, in 14 and 15. Basically, where all the researchers would go, typically at AAAI, and they would come together and to present papers and talk over the results of the competition. And this helped a lot with bringing together the people in the area. The next main result, 2015, heads-up limit Hold'em. This was the version that was in the 08 and 09 competition. Heads-up limit Hold'em poker is solved. This was from Michael Bowling and the group of Alberta. I believe it was published in Science Journal. And so what this means solved actually, so in theory, as I'll get into, and as you probably studied in the course, in two-player zero-sum games, there exists a Nash equilibrium that if you were to play it, it would guarantee, at least if you switch the roles of player 1 and 2, you would guarantee at least tying. You would guarantee winning or tying against any opponent. There exists a Nash equilibrium, and so now it's a little bit tricky here. They didn't actually technically solve it in the same way that a game like checkers or chess would be solved, they actually solved it up to a small epsilon approximation error, which they argue is so small that a human couldn't differentiate between their program and an actual equilibrium in a lifetime of play. But it's worth noting they didn't actually formally solve it. They call it weakly essentially solved, I believe is their wording. Nonetheless, it's considered to be solved, limit Texas Hold'em, and actually you can play against their agent on their website if the agent is called Cepheus. And in 2015, this is for no limit Texas Hold'em, a very different variant. And so there was the Brains vs. AI competition, which I participated in. This was CMU team. This was held in Pittsburgh. I'll be talking about this in detail later on. Here we played our program against the strongest human specialists in the world in two-player no limit Texas Hold'em. And so we unfortunately, the humans won that first time. And actually in 2017, perhaps you read about it, there was just a rematch, a second Brains vs. AI competition, and the computers won pretty significantly this time. And so similar to limit Texas Hold'em, we had, the humans win the first time, and then the computers come back and win the next time. That said, we're not at the point where no limit Texas Hold'em is solved like it is for limit Texas Hold'em, and so there still is probably a lot more work to do in order to get to that point. And so a few other things I didn't mention. So the computer poker tutorial. So this what I'm giving now, very similar to the tutorial I gave at AAAI. I actually gave an earlier tutorial at EC in 2016. And in addition to the second Brains vs. AI, that was with the agent called Lebratus, there was also another very recent no limit competition. There was an agent called Deep Stack from the University of Alberta. They had another competition. They used a smaller sample and they played against human professionals, but not specialists in two-player no limit Texas Hold'em, and they also won. And so computers defeated humans in this other recent competition as well. I believe that was published in Science Journal as well. And so this is sort of an overview. You can see there's been a lot of progress over the last decade or so, from just sort of starting with heuristics to actually solving, limit and beating, the best humans in no limit. And so the last, 10, 15 years, there's been a huge amount of progress on this particular, on poker. And so, actually, before I get into the content, I'll mention that this talk I'm giving, this is part of a tutorial I gave at AAAI, and this is actually just part one. There were 3 different parts of the tutorial, and so mine is sort of, it's an overview of a lot of the different components that go into the poker agents, but there were 2 other parts that I think are essential if you really want to be caught up with the state of the poker, and so maybe at the end I'll give links to the slides that the other presenters used. One of them, so in terms of the Nash equilibrium algorithms, I'm not going to get into too much detail into their CFR EGT, a lot of variance, a lot of theory with them. That was Kevin Waugh presented that in part 2 of the tutorial, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. Also in part 3, Johannes Heinrich talked about deep learning and some other areas, and so I'm not going to get into too much detail in those particular topics, but I can refer you to part 2 and part 3 of the tutorial I gave from AAAI. And so I'm sort of going to be focusing on all the different main components that go into poker agents, talking about a few theoretical and empirical results on them, but I'm not going to be able to talk about everything that's involved in all of these aspects of the area. So probably a little bit of review, since you're all been taking a game theory course this semester, but game theory has been applied to all areas, most notably in economics and business. For an example, there's bidding in auctions and deciding what offers to propose and accept or reject in negotiations, or a few examples. In political science, and law, decide how to fairly divide resources, for example, in a divorce settlement. Recently, there's been some interest in biology and in medicine, particular problem that actually applied an algorithm that was developed in the course of research on poker was looking at a robust diabetes management problem where it's a single agent optimization. It's a Markov decision process which has certain parameters in the problem, and if you view them as being selected adversarially, then the problem of achieving robustness becomes a two-player zero-sum game, and you can apply one of the algorithms that was developed for equilibrium computation in poker. And so that's an interesting recent application. And so within computer science, game theory has been applied to all the different areas, been studied and applied to theory, to AI, to programming languages, to systems. A few examples are national security, deciding, deploying officers to protect ports and sort of coming up with randomized policies for when to conduct surveillance. There's cybersecurity, for example, deciding optimal thresholds to prevent against phishing attacks, and a lot of phenomena of the internet, such as ad auctions. So this is an example of a matrix game, strategic form game. It's rock, paper, scissors. We have two players. We have the row player and the column player, and each player is going to select an action, also called a pure strategy. And so here, on the strategy profile is a vector of strategies, one for each player. For instance, the row player could do capital rock, and the column player could do lowercase p for paper. And then utility function set gives a payoff to each player, each strategy profile. And so at big R little p, the row player gets -1, and the column player gets +1. Now, if the sum of the payoffs at each of the profiles is 0, then it's called a zero-sum game. You can see that this is zero-sum game because 1 and -1 is 0, 0 and 0 is 0, etc. And these model purely adversarial settings where the losses of one player are directly offset by the winnings of the other player. Now, we don't restrict players to only playing one action. Playing deterministically, we allow them to randomize. So for instance, they could do rock probably 0.6, paper probably 0.3, scissors probably 0.1, etc. And we define a best response to be any strategy that maximizes payoff against the opponent's strategy. So if player 2 is doing 0.6 on rock, 0.3 on paper, 0.1 on scissors, then a best response for player 1 is going to be to play paper, which does best against rock, to play that with probability 1. So Nash equilibrium, which is the solution concept I started off talking about from John Nash's thesis, which has emerged as, I would argue, as the standard solution concept, not the only one, but certainly the most common solution concept in game theory. And so this is defined as a strategy profile where all players are simultaneously playing a best response to the strategies of the other players. And one of the main results is that it's guaranteed to always exist, at least in finite games and all games like matrix games and most other classes of games. In rock, paper, scissors game, there's a unique Nash equilibrium, and it's for both players to randomize a third, a third, a third. It's pretty easy to see. If the player didn't do this, if you put more weight on rock, then he would want to put all his weight on paper, and then you wouldn't want to play rock anymore, so anything else wouldn't be a Nash equilibrium. In general, of course, there could be many equilibria, not just one. And so for these two-player zero-sum games that I just defined, there's this additional result, the minimax theorem, that there exists a value V star and a mixed strategy profile sigma star, such that player 1 guarantees a payoff of at least V star in the worst case if he follows sigma star, and player 2 can guarantee a payoff of at least negative V star in the worst case if he follows sigma star. And this V star is the value of the game to player 1. I'll also call it V1. And so, in V2 you can call negative V star. And so all equilibrium strategies for player I are going to guarantee at least VI in the worst case. And so this value, it could favor player 1, it could favor player 2, it could be positive or negative. It just so happens, rock, paper, scissors, that it's 0, but in general it doesn't need to be 0. In poker it may or may not be. Actually, people are pretty sure that it favors the first player to act when you're playing two-player. It doesn't have to be 0. So the exploitability of a strategy is defined as the difference between the value of the game and the performance against the best response. So every equilibrium is going to have 0 exploitability because it achieves the value against the best response. And for instance, in rock, paper, scissors, if you always play rock, you're going to have exploitability of 1 because the worst case it's going to get -1 and the value is 0. And so 0 minus -1 is 1. And so everything else is going to fall somewhere, in this particular game, somewhere between 0 and 1 in terms of the exploitability. So these two-player zero-sum games I mentioned, they have this special minimax theorem, but they're also sort of special in a few other ways. And so one of them, so I mentioned all Nash equilibria have 0 exploitability, and so we can view this as being the same as saying that the Nash equilibrium strategies are unbeatable. And this would be assuming you alternate as player 1 and player 2, like you do in poker, you switch positions, but if you alternate as player 1, player 2, and you play Nash equilibrium, you would guarantee an expectation, at least, that you would either win or tie against any opponent. And of course, in any given sample, you could lose in the short run. This is an expectation. So overall, in the long run, you would be unbeatable. And so this makes Nash equilibrium pretty compelling, pretty compelling goal to try to find one, because we would guarantee being unbeatable if we were able to get it. Now, furthermore, it doesn't matter really if we find one Nash equilibrium and the opponent is playing another. There's this exchangeability property that if AB and CD are both equilibria, then AD and CB are also. And so it doesn't really matter if we find one and the opponent is playing another one, and maybe they don't match up, but it turns out it will still be an equilibrium. And so another very important factor from a computer science perspective is that in two-player zero-sum games, we can compute a Nash equilibrium in polynomial time. There exists a linear program formulation, and so we can find in polynomial time, we can compute an equilibrium. And so it's a pretty compelling solution concept in these games. Now, in other games, pretty much none of those results hold if it's not zero-sum or if there's more than 2 players. So there can be multiple Nash equilibria. Each of them can, with different payoffs to the different players. We can also have the following. We can have one player follows a Nash equilibrium, and if one player follows one and the other players follow a different one, then the overall profile may not be a Nash equilibrium, while it would be in two-player zero-sum game. Furthermore, if one player plays an equilibrium, he could actually do worse if one or more opponents deviate from that equilibrium. Now, the opponent who deviates will do worse. If one person deviates, he'll do worse because it's an equilibrium, but or he can do the same, but actually we could do worse as well, whereas that couldn't happen in a two-player zero-sum game. And furthermore, it is hard to compute an equilibrium in these games. It's p-pad hard, and it's conjectured that no efficient algorithms exist. So it's a much less compelling solution concept in these other games. Now, most of my talk, not all of it, but most of it is going to be talking about two-player zero-sum game, which two-player poker is an instance of, but it's worth noting, that these other issues arise with these other games. So, in many important games, so far I've talked about these games where both players are simultaneously moving, like rock, paper, scissors. In many important games, there's information that's private to only some agents and not available to other agents. So, for instance, in an auction, a bidder might know my valuation, and I might know the distribution of the other agent's valuations, but I might not know exactly what their valuation is. In poker, I know my private cards. I don't know what cards the other player has dealt. I just know the distribution that they're from. And so for these games, rather than a matrix, we typically will represent them in a tree. Sometimes it's from top to bottom. This one just so happens to be left to right. And so these trees are defined by the following. So you have a root node here. This is a simplified poker game. We start with a move. Green is a move of chance, of nature, which is dealing a winning or losing hand with probably 1/2 to player 1. And then player 1 is going to choose a bet size, 0, 1, or 2, and then player 1 acts, and then player 2 is going to choose if he wants to call or fold. And so actually player 2, when he acts, say player 1 bets 1, player 2 doesn't know if he's down here or if he's up there because he doesn't know what card player 1 was dealt. And so that's indicated by this dashed line called an information set. And so a player can't differentiate between which node he's at if they're in the same information set. And then, so player 2 acts, and then you go to a leaf node, and then the players are going to receive a payoff. You can see here this game is zero sum because all the at the leaf nodes, all the payoffs are summing to 0. And so this is typically used to represent these imperfect information games. You can see these new features, the chance moves, the information sets, these sequential actions. Nonetheless, it turns out that that there's a lot of similarities. Basically, all the theory I presented earlier also applies to these games. And so the two-player zero-sum extensive-form games, these can be solved in polynomial time as well by linear programming. And the LP algorithm scales up to games with about 10 to the 8 states. And so, one could ask, well, why study, two-player poker if it can be solved polynomial time? Well, it turns out that there are games we're interested in that are much larger than 10 to the 8th, and so we can't just apply the standard LP algorithm. So I mentioned sort of in the timeline slide, some of these newer iterative algorithms that have been developed, CFR for counterfactual regret minimization, EGT for excessive gap technique. And so these, which compute, they compute epsilon equilibrium, they converge to Nash equilibrium in the limit. There are these iterative algorithms, and if you run them long enough, they'll converge to equilibrium. And so these scale to games with about 10 to the 17th states. And so I'll point out that CFR can also be run, it can apply to multiplayer games and general sum games, though it doesn't have any significant guarantees in those classes. And so at a high level, this MCCFR algorithm, it's a self-play algorithm. So at each information set, it stores a regret and an average strategy. And it plays against itself over and over again. It samples down the tree. And it keeps updating these regrets and strategies based on performance. And in the limit, it converges to equilibrium. There's a lot of different variants. It actually parallelizes very well. And I'll talk about this a little bit in my talk, but actually a lot of the details of CFR were in part 2 of the tutorial I gave at AAAI, and so I'm not going to get too into the specific theoretical guarantees and all the different sampling variants that have been used in the course of poker research, but I can give a link at the end to Kevin's slides if you're interested in more information on that. And so, okay, so I've talked about sort of how, there's games, and these can be solved in polynomial time in theory, but, in practice, there are game instances like poker that are really, really large, and we can't just solve. And even 10 to the 17th is not large enough for some of the games, like No Limit Texas Hold'em, that we want to solve. And so to solve these really large games, the standard paradigm that's emerged has been the following. And so rather than just applying an equilibrium algorithm to solve it, we typically apply what's called an abstraction algorithm, automated abstraction, to reduce the full game to a smaller game that's similar strategically to the initial game. Then the smaller game we solve using an equilibrium algorithm, and then we apply a procedure to map this abstraction equilibrium to an equilibrium in the original game, or to an approximate equilibrium in the initial game. And so this is the standard paradigm that's been used by most of the strongest agents for No Limit Texas Hold'em. I'll talk about a few modifications that have recently been developed later on in the lecture. And so Texas Hold'em, like I mentioned, so it's this very large game of imperfect information, and since around 2006, with the competition, it's been the most studied imperfect information game within the AI community, so for about a decade now. Now, particular, there's been most of the attention has been on the two-player variants, in large part because it's easier, and there's a clear goal. There's clear, it's very compelling. If you were using a computer in equilibrium, it would be unbeatable. Whereas it's a lot less clear what a goal would be in multiplayer. It is 2 player 0 sum, and poker, I'll point out, this isn't just sort of a toy problem that's been invented to be studied in academics. This is poker, no limit Texas Hold'em, is played for a lot of money online and live in casinos, and it's very popular for humans. So the limit Texas Hold'em variant, where there's a fixed betting size, has about 10 to the 17th nodes in the game tree. By contrast, no limit, where you can bet any size up to the amount you have in your stack, at least according to the rules of the competition, it has 10 to the 165 nodes in the game tree. And no limit has really been the most active domain the last several years. I mentioned the very exciting results really this year and then the last year or two. And it's also the most popular variant for humans. So very briefly, the rules, I'm not going to give all the full rules, but I'll give enough so that you can at least follow most of the algorithms I'll be presenting later. So 2 players, and they have a stack of chips in front of them, and then they pay some ante called blinds, and then each player is dealt 2 private cards that only they see. There's a round of betting. The first round is called the pre-flop, and so players are allowed to they have several possible actions they can do. They can fold, which is basically to forfeit the pot to the other player. They can call and match the bet made by the other player and remain in the pot, or they can bet or raise any amount additionally up to what they have left in their stack. Now, if the player folds at any point, then he just basically forfeits the pot and the other player wins. Now, if the players are still in after the pre-flop, then the next round, called the flop, there's 3 cards dealt face up, and another round of betting. And then if a player folds again, he loses. If both players are still in, then there's another round called the turn, and another round of betting, and then with the public card, and then if they're still again, there's a final round called the river. And if both players are still in, then they turn their cards over. The person who has the best hand is going to win the whole pot. And so this is, and so if we allow them to bet any amount, this is no limit. It would be limit if the bets were restricted to a specific bet amount. Now, I've mentioned already that we need this game abstraction for these really large games. For instance, 2 player no limit Texas Hold'em has 10 to the 165 game states, and the best solvers only scale to about 10 to the 17th. And so we need to somehow approximate the game, make it smaller, so that we can solve it. And so there's 2 main types of abstraction that have been developed. One of them is information abstraction, which is where we're grouping together similar information sets or hands that we think are similar in some way. And the second is action abstraction, which is where we are basically removing certain actions, in particular by discretizing the action space to a smaller number of allowable actions to make it smaller. For instance, in an auction, you could only allow bids that are a multiple of 100 or 10, or typically in poker, we would restrict players to only being able to bet a few bet sizes, half pot or the pot, or 2 times the pot, or all in, etc. And so actually, the second type, the action abstraction, has typically been done through human expert knowledge, domain knowledge, to come up with these abstractions, and there hasn't been much done algorithmically. And so I'm not going to talk too much about the action abstraction, but actually for information abstraction, there's been a lot of algorithms done over the years. So I'm going to talk now about the algorithms for information abstraction. So here's an example. It's a little bit cut off on the right, and so basically, the problem we're trying to do is we have all these hands, and we have to say, well, which hands are similar, right? You might argue, you know, if your starting hand for pre-flop, you know, pocket aces, which is the best hand you can have, and pocket kings are both very, very strong hands. And so if you group them, say you group them together and call them bucket one for the pre-flop, and just said, okay, I'm going to play them, treat them as one larger state, and just force myself to play the same way, you know, for every hand in that state, then you probably wouldn't lose too much, and you know, it would probably be fine, because pocket aces and pocket kings are very, very good hands for pre-flop. You probably wouldn't lose anything. But now, you know, let's take a more subtle example. So here, this is if you have a pair of sixes as your hand, six of clubs, six of diamonds, and this other one is a king of clubs, queen of clubs. And now, are these similar? Should we group these together? And so, how do you figure that out? And so the most obvious way to start would be to say, okay, let's assign a real number to each hand that gives the strength of that hand. And so for instance, for the 6-6, and so the way to do this, the most obvious way would say, okay, let's assume uniform random cards for the board, and then uniform random cards for what the opponent could have. And then how well do we do? What percentage of the time do we win, you know, lose and tie against the uniform random cards? And so for 6-6, it turns out that the expected hand strength, EHS, would be 0.634, and for the king, queen of clubs, it would be 0.633. And so using that metric, you would say, well, these are very, very similar hands. And actually, the initial agents for poker used, the initial abstraction algorithms did use this metric. And now, however, the limitation of this metric is that it's not necessarily going to look at the full distribution for where this strength would be. So for instance, on some boards, on some sets of 5 public cards, 6-6 is going to win, you know, only 30% of the time against a random hand, right? If there's a lot of higher cards to a 6, it might only win against 30%. If there's a third 6 on the board, then it might win, you know, 95% of the time. And so if you look at the full distribution, you can see it has a lot of mass here between 0.4 and 0.6, but not very much here between 0.7 and 0.9. Now on the other hand, if you look at the king-queen, it has, you know, relatively little mass between 0.4 and 0.6, and it has a lot between the 0.8 and the 0.9. And so if you look at these full distributions, they are actually very different, even though the expectation is the same. And so the newer abstraction algorithms have taken this into account, and so as opposed to just using the expected hand strength to group hands together, they look at the full histogram, and one popular distance metric that's been used is called Earth movers distance, where it basically says what would be the cost if you were to transform one histogram into another, how much mass do you have to move multiplied by the distance it has to move. There's an efficient algorithm for doing this, and so one of the main algorithms has been, that's been a big improvement over just looking at the expected hand strength, has done Earth movers distance with these histograms. Now I decided to take this a little bit further, and so I wanted to look at the following, and so it's possible you can have 2 hands. So here's another example, a little more complicated. This is 2 different hands on the flop, and this is the same distribution, assuming they get to the river. And so here, this first hand is if the private cards are the queen of diamonds and 10 of clubs, and the board cards are the queen, 9, and 7 of hearts. And so now we have top pair of queens, and don't have a draw to a flush. The second hand is if we have the 9 of diamonds, 5 of clubs, and the board is 7, 5, and 3 of diamonds. And so in this hand, we have the second pair, and we do have a draw to a flush. And so you can see here that the expected hand strength are similar. They're both around 0.68. And actually, the distributions look very similar too. However, this is assuming they get to the river. Now, it turns out if you look at the distributions in the next round on the turn, where each point is now the expected strength, assuming a uniform random river, they are very, very different. And so if you look at the Earth movers distance that I mentioned between these, using comparable units to the river, it's 4.519 here, whereas for the river ones that I just had, it was using comparable normalization, which is 0.559. And so my point here is that these two hands, if they make it to the river, they're going to have very similar distribution. So they're both hands, we're still just on the flop now, they're flop hands. If they make it all the way to the river, they're going to have the same distribution, but in the next round, they're not going to have very similar distribution. So overall, the trajectory of the distributions between them is very, very different, and so you might want to group them differently, even though they have the same Earth mover's distance over the final distribution. And so I wanted to look at grouping the together hands that have the same trajectory of distribution over the rounds, and to do this, I came up with an algorithm for doing potential aware. Potential aware is when you take into account the full distribution. Abstraction using Earth mover's distance, basically a bottom-up algorithm where we start for the river, and we assume that we've computed an abstraction already for the ground below. You can use any algorithm for the river. And now suppose you have the mean of the cluster in the next round. Now for each pair of clusters, let's see, for each pair of round n+1 clusters, we compute a distance. So the distance between the clusters is the distance between the means of the next cluster. Then for each point now at the current round, we create a histogram over the clusters in the next round, and we compute an abstraction by using Earth mover's multi-dimensional Earth mover's distance, by using this distance between the mean clusters as the ground distance function. And so it turns out actually that you can do this multi-dimensional Earth mover's distance. There exists solvers for it, but I used the fastest one available, and it was still too slow, the best commercially available one, so I had to come up with a fast heuristic for doing this in our setting that was able to make this efficiently usable for no-limit Texas Hold'em. I guess there's a lot of specifics in the algorithms used. If you're interested, I had a paper on this. This was at, let me see, I think it was at AAAI in 2014 with more details of this algorithm. And so this was able to do basically group together hands that have the same trajectory over the whole game of string. So I talked a little bit about this abstraction phase here of deciding, well, how do we make the game smaller by determining which information sets are similar and can be grouped together. And so this produces a smaller game that can then be solved using an equilibrium algorithm. And so now I'm going to talk actually a little bit more. I'm going to branch into starting to talk about the equilibrium algorithm, but actually I'm going to talk about an approach that required using the abstraction algorithm as well. And so here, like I mentioned, CFR parallelizes very well. You can do this sampling down the tree using, in parallel. Now, one problem is that this runs into issues if you're on distributed architectures and supercomputers with this latency when you go between blades. And so we had access, this was in 2014 was the first time, I think, for the computer poker competition, we had access to this big supercomputer. We wanted to do parallel CFR, but we were running into this latency issue. And so we wanted to come up with an abstraction algorithm that ensured that when we sample down the tree, you're only staying on states that are on the same blade, same core, or same blade, so that we can efficiently scale up to the supercomputer. And so the high-level approach is that we're going to create an information abstraction that allows us to assign disjoint components of the tree to different blades so that the trajectory of sample-only accesses information sets in the same blade. We accomplish this by first we cluster the public information at some early point. So in poker, we cluster the public flop cards. Then we're going to cluster the private information separately for each of these public clusters for the flop, turn, and river rounds. And then we're going to basically, each of these public clusters is going to be assigned to a different blade. And then once we've done this, we're going to run a modified version of this MCCFR algorithm that's going to be able to work with this new abstraction. And so, was that the music, by the way?
Yeah.
First, so should we take a little break?
This is the first 45 minutes, so we should take a 5 minutes break.
Okay.